Hey Nir, welcome. I'm really excited to have you here. Saying that you've had an incredible career would be an understatement. You've worked at BCG, co-founded and sold two companies, and written some of the top best-selling books in the world. So to kick things off, I'd love to have you spend a little bit of time, a couple of minutes, just introducing yourself and telling our audience about yourself in your own words.
Sure. Thank you for that introduction. I appreciate it. Yeah. My name is Nir Eyal, and I am a behavioral designer. So I help companies build the kind of products and services that get people hooked to healthy habits. So I work primarily with healthcare, with financial services, education products, any type of product or service that can improve people's lives by helping them form good habits. So I spent many years teaching at the Stanford Graduate School of Business, and then later at the Hasso-Plattner Institute of Design. And then I wrote my first book, Hooked: How to Build Habit-Forming Products. And then more recently, I wrote my second book, Indestructible: How to Control Your Attention and Choose Your Life, which is about the other side. So if Hooked is about how to build good habits, Indestructible is about how to break bad habits.
That's awesome. And speaking of that, the MIT Technology Review has called you the prophet of habit forming technology. And your book Hook that you referenced is the industry standard playbook for building these habit forming products. I'm curious, like what sparked your interest in habits and in that industry, and what led you to write Hooked?
Yeah, so I was really fascinated by how these companies do it. So when we think about the world's most habit-forming products, when we think about Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, WhatsApp, Slack, Snapchat, YouTube, I wanted to figure out what's their secret. How do they do it? How did they keep people coming back? And so the more research I did, I realized that these techniques can be used by everyone, right? So I didn't write the Hooked for their benefit. I wrote it for our benefit. I wanted a book, frankly, for myself so that I could build the next habit-forming product. And once I discovered these techniques, I started blogging about them. I didn't intend to write a book originally. I just, was sharing what I was learning, and with the intent of kind of codifying what I was picking up so that I could build a product myself. And that kind of became my product. So a professor from Stanford who I took a class with when I was there reached out and said, "Hey, I really like your stuff. What do you think about teaching a class with me?" And so I jumped up at the opportunity, and we built a class together. And then kind of one thing led to another, and I kept down this line of exploration. But really, it started from trying to scratch my own itch that I wanted to figure out how to build habit forming products for myself, because I wanted to start another product company, and I didn't see any guidebook for how to do that. And so I decided to research it myself.
No, that totally makes sense. And I think the majority of our audience has probably already heard and is familiar with the hook model. But it would be an honor to hear you briefly explain it in your own words.
Sure. So the hook model is a four-step process that connects the user's problem to your product with enough frequency to form a habit. So it's through successive cycles through these hooks that our preferences are shaped, that our tastes are formed, and that our habits take hold. So every hook starts with a trigger. A trigger is some kind of call to action. It tells us what to do next. Most people think about external triggers, which are all the pings, dings, and rings, everything in our outside environment that tells us what to do. But it turns out that the vast majority of our triggers are internal triggers. Internal triggers are uncomfortable emotional states that we seek to escape from. So when we're lonely, we check Facebook. When we're uncertain, we Google. When we're bored, we lots of things we can do for boredom, right? We can check the news, stock prices, sports scores, all kinds of things we can do to escape boredom. So the ultimate goal of a habit-forming product is to be the product or service that you turn to with little or no conscious thought whenever you feel that internal trigger, so that eventually the product doesn't need to trigger you with external triggers at all. It only you use it based on how you are feeling, and that's when a product really forms a habit. So that's the first step, is the trigger phase. So having a clear external trigger, and then an identified internal trigger that your product will attach its use to. The next step of the hook is the action phase, which is defined as the simplest behavior done in anticipation of a reward. So the simplest thing the user can do to get relief from that discomfort: scrolling a feed, pushing a play button, checking a dashboard, whatever the case might be, the simplest action done in anticipation of reward. The next step of the hook model is the variable reward phase, which is where the user's itch is scratched a little bit. So this typically happens not only is the reward rewarding, but it's also variable. So this comes from the classic work of B.F. Skinner, where the father of operant conditioning, he had these experiments where he took pigeons, he put them in a little box. Today we call this a Skinner box. And he found that whenever he gave the pigeon a treat, a little food pellet, the pigeon would peck at the disc to get the food pellet. And this is called operant conditioning. No big deal. We if you ever had a puppy or, kids, you probably train their behavior in one way or another with what we call operant conditioning. But then Skinner had a problem. You see, one day he walked into his lab and he found he didn't have enough of these food pellets. He was going to run out. So he couldn't afford to give the pigeons a food pellet every time they pecked at the disc. He could only afford to give it to them once in a while. So sometimes the pigeon would peck at the disc. There'd be no reward. No food pellet would come out. The next time the pigeon would peck at the disc, they would receive a treat. And what Skinner found, to his amazement, was that the rate of response, the number of times the pigeon pecked at the disc, increased when the reward was given on a variable schedule of reinforcement. So we see this phenomenon in all sorts of products and services. When we think about what makes a book fun to read, well, it's about the uncertainty of the ending. Why do we watch sports on TV, whether it's football or cricket or whatever? We like watching these balls bounce around a pitch or a court because it's variable. We don't know what's going to happen next. Gambling, right? Why are games of chance fun? Because there's uncertainty there. Movies, the news, all these things. Of course, your news feed, the reason we check social media, it's all about variability. It's all about this uncertainty that we seek to try and control and understand, and it's very entertaining. So that variable reward phase is at the center of these of this 4 steps of the hook model. But there's one more step, and that last step is what's called the investment phase. The investment phase is something the user does to increase the likelihood of them coming back. Now, investments come in 2 forms, or they serve 2 purposes, I should say. They either load the next trigger, so something that the user does to bring themselves back. So for example, if I send a message on WhatsApp, I don't get any kind of immediate reward when I do that. What I'm doing is I'm loading the next trigger because I'm likely to get a reply. And that reply comes coupled in the form of a notification, an external trigger that prompts me through the hook once again. So that's the first way that investments increase the likelihood of the next pass, is by loading the next trigger. The second way is by storing value. And this is a really big deal. So this has never been done in the history of manufacturing. The fact that people can make a product get better and better with use. If you think about most goods and services, they depreciate. We use them up, right? Your clothing, your car, your furniture. The more you use these things, the less valuable they become. They depreciate. Habit-forming products do the opposite. Habit-forming products, the more we interact with them, the more valuable they become because of this concept of stored value. So the more data you put into a product, the more content you upload, the more followers you accrue, the better your reputation on a site, the more valuable it becomes to you, and the stickier it is, the harder it is to leave.
That totally makes sense. And so, when you're explaining this, you made me think of TikTok, which, has been described as one of the most addictive products of the last decade. Would you agree, with that statement? I'm curious, is there anything that TikTok is doing differently here, or so that supplements your hook model that makes it so habit forming? Because I can definitely see the variable rewards, in the feed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, TikTok follows the hook model to a T. It's probably one of the best examples. And in fact, it's one of the few apps that I cannot have on my phone because it's too much. Now, addiction is a funny word. We need to be careful about that term. And addiction is a medical disorder, right? It is a pathology. Between 3 to 5% of the population has some kind of addiction, but it's very rare, right? And 95% of us do not have an addiction. What we have is a distraction. So I don't know if I would say that, it addicts everybody. It certainly doesn't, just like all kinds of substances that are much more addictive than TikTok. Alcohol is very addictive, but very few people get addicted to it. How many of us have a glass of wine with dinner or a beer with lunch, but we're not alcoholics. So I think it's something similar with TikTok. It can be a distraction for sure. And that's why I don't have it on my phone, because I found it doesn't serve me, right? That it's nice, it's entertaining, it's fun, but at the end of the day, when I look back and I say, okay, did I spend my time the way I wanted to? I decided it wasn't a good use of my time, and so I don't have TikTok on my phone. But yeah, you see the hook model in spades in TikTok, right? What's the internal trigger? It's boredom, right? I mean, I don't know. Growing up, we used to watch America's Funniest Home Videos. Did you
Yep.
ever see that show?
Yeah.
That's all
Yeah.
TikTok is, essentially. I mean, what you know, Bob Saget would stand in front of on our television sets, and it was one of the most popular shows in America, and he would show us funny clips. That's what it was. It's the same thing. That's what TikTok is. It's just a lot of funny videos, and it's no surprise that people like it. What's different is that even though we go to it for the same internal trigger, right? The internal trigger is boredom. The action couldn't be easier. Now we don't have to wait for Thursdays at 7 p.m. for America's Funniest Home Videos to come on TV. We have it in our phones. So it's so much easier to access. Then the variable rewards. Well, the variable rewards are, of course, the videos. And then the investment is the fact that the more you use it, the more data they're collecting about you and the more they're tailoring the future videos based on what you're feeding the algorithm. So that's something that the television couldn't do either. So they're following the hook model to a T. I mean, it's a product that is very engaging and potentially a big time waster if you're not careful.
No, I totally agree with that. And naturally, like when we're thinking about these sticky products, we think about consumer facing apps like TikTok. But I'm curious, like, can you speak to a little bit about how this model applies to B2B products? Are there any differences there that we need to be mindful of?
Yeah, so the line of demarcation is not enterprise or consumer web. The line of demarcation is frequent or infrequent. So if a product is not used frequently, it's very difficult to form a habit around that product. So the cutoff point seems to be about a week's time or less. And of course, the more frequently the behavior, the more likely the user is to form a habit. So we see the exact same phenomenon with enterprise products, particularly SaaS products, right? Products that if people don't use, they're going to stop paying for. The same exact rules apply. So whether it's Salesforce, Stack Overflow, GitHub, I mean, the list goes on and on. If you think of many successful SaaS products, they all have to form habits because again, if people don't use them, they churn out, they stop paying for them. So it's absolutely critical in the enterprise space. If it's a repeat product, a repeat use product, that people form habits around that product. Where it's not as useful is for products that are used infrequently. So for example, let's take cybersecurity software, right? Cybersecurity software typically is not something you use every day. It's something you buy. It sits on some server somewhere and you don't use it until something terrible happens or some kind of breach. Well, that's a sales-driven company versus a product-driven company, right? It needs to be sold into the enterprise. And then once it's bought, it's not used unless something terrible happens. That's not a product you need to form a habit around, again, because it's not used frequently. But if it's a product that does need frequent engagement, enterprise or consumer web, doesn't matter, it's got to have a hook.
That makes sense. So I like that line is frequency versus not using the product as frequently. So are there any, you mentioned like Slack, GitHub, and a few other B2B products. Is there one that you can break down similar to how you did TikTok that you think has done a good job of following the hook model?
I think Slack is a terrific example, the world's largest group messaging service, right? Especially now that people are working from home, we're on it all the time, right? So what's the hook? It's the internal trigger. We always want to look for internal triggers. We want to look for existing needs. And so, the existing behavior used to be standing around the water cooler, right? Before Slack, what did people do? They got together in the break room and they chit chatted. What's going on? What's the latest? So the fear of missing out, FOMO, is probably the biggest reason for using Slack, making sure that you're up to date on what's happening in the office. That's the internal trigger. The action is to, open the app to check the feed of different channels. The variable reward is what's in the channels, right? What are people talking about? It's what we call rewards of the tribe. And then the investment is to participate, that when you send a message, when you add to the conversation, when you add to the Slack channel, you are loading the next trigger because you're likely to get some kind of interaction with what you said. And the more you add to that conversation, either by adding people to it, by adding APIs to Slack, all kinds of things you can do to customize, to invest in the platform, you're making it more valuable with use, which means you're more likely to stick with it.
That totally makes sense. Thank you for breaking that down.
Sure.
Similar to like, using, the hook model to build sticky products, another tactic that people use is gamification. And every, major tech company has played around with it at some point. But sometimes it makes a lot of sense to use it, and other times it feels very forced. There's a study done that showed that 80% of gamification efforts actually fail. So it's usually in a large part because these product builders don't know when it's appropriate and when it's not. So can you speak to that a little bit on when you think a company should use gamification? Can you think of an example of a company that has done it really well, where it just feels seamless? And any guiding principles you have around that?
Sure. So I'm not the biggest fan of gamification. I think that I'm not surprised by that statistic that 80% of the time it doesn't work. And I know why it doesn't work. The reason it doesn't work is because it's like trying to serve what we call in the industry chocolate covered broccoli. Chocolate covered broccoli is when we take something we think people need, right? They need to eat their vegetables, but they don't want to eat their vegetables. So what do? We put chocolate on top of it and think, oh, now they're going to love it. Well, nobody likes chocolate covered broccoli. That's disgusting. So that's kind of what gamification tends to do. Now, the reason it doesn't work is that it's not based on the right internal trigger. So if the internal trigger is boredom, well, then gamification is great because gamification entertains, right? So that's an appropriate use of gamification, is when the internal trigger is boredom. Gamification entertains. But when the internal trigger is something else, right? Let's say it's workplace uncertainty. Let's say it's anxiety. Let's say it's stress. I don't want your stupid badges and points and leaderboards. Get out of my face, right? So the idea here is that we always want to connect the reward with the internal trigger. If the internal trigger is loneliness, we have to connect people together. If the internal trigger is uncertainty, we have to give people assurance. So it's not that gamification is bad, it's that it's generally misapplied. It should really only be used when the internal trigger is boredom.
That makes sense. And, I can think of an example of companies that have faced backlash for that. A prime example is Robinhood. Whenever you make a trade on it, they just drop a lot of confetti on the screen. And it's sort of that reward system that you're describing, encouraging you to probably want to trade more because they make money on selling order flow data. So I'd love to, hear a little bit more about the responsibility that product builders have to ensure that we aren't abusing the hook model or abusing gamification to the detriment of consumers.
Yeah. So for the vast majority of us, we don't need to worry about addicting anybody, right? So the vast majority of products, nobody's getting addicted to educational software. Nobody's getting addicted to enterprise SaaS software. Like the vast majority of products, they don't worry about getting people to overuse a product. They're just wishing anybody would use their products. So, the real problem is not that a few companies are building the kind of products that suck us in. The real problem is that the vast majority of products suck. And that's why we need to apply these techniques more, right? The vast majority of products are just awful and need to be more user-friendly and more engaging so that people actually do the things they want to do with these products, but for lack of good product design, don't do. So I think a good way to think about this is to understand what is manipulation. Manipulation has a negative connotation, but it's not necessarily a bad thing because there are two forms of manipulation. There's what we call persuasion. Persuasion is a form of manipulation, and persuasion is about helping the user do things they want to do. Now, we have to understand that all design is a form of manipulation, whether it's interaction design, whether it's usability design, whether it's graphic design, interior design. All design is a form of manipulation. Anytime you are designing an experience to change behavior or emotion, you are manipulating people. But we pay for the privilege to be manipulated, right? Don't we want a physical space to manipulate our emotions, to make us feel a certain way? That's why we hire interior designers, right? Graphic designers, interaction designers. These people are manipulating our experiences. But to do it ethically, we have to make sure it persuades, making sure that the definition of persuasion is an experience that helps the user do something they themselves want to do. The opposite of persuasion is coercion. Coercion is unethical. Coercion is getting people to do things they don't want to do. Now, you can sum up the difference between persuasion and coercion in one word, and that one word is regret. Regret. We want to make sure that we never build a product that the user will regret using. And so that simple test to ask ourselves, hey, if we use this design pattern, if we use this technique, and then users look back, will they regret using our product? That's a pretty good test to make sure that you're designing ethically. Because look, the fact of the matter is, not only is it bad ethically to coerce people, it's bad for business, right? Because in this day and age, if you coerce somebody, if you trick them to doing something they later regret, not only are they not going to do business with you anymore, they're going to tell everybody they know not to do business with you anymore. So it behooves you ethically and for the profit motive to make sure that we only persuade and we never coerce.
That makes total sense. Switching gears a little bit, you recently published a new book called Indestructible, which helps people focus in this world of infinite distractions. I personally have really found a lot of value in the book as someone who's, consistently just bombarded with push notifications and has a high screen time. So I'm curious, like, what inspired you to write Indestructible?
Yeah, so Indistractable really came again from just like my the reason I wrote Hooked. It was I needed it. I wrote it for
Yeah.
me. I found I was very distracted, that I wasn't doing what I said I was going to do. I would say I was going to eat right and exercise, and yet I didn't, and I wouldn't. I would say I was going to finish a big project at work, and yet somehow 20, 30, 40 minutes later, I wasn't working on the thing I said I was going to work on. And so in all these areas of my life, I found that my struggle wasn't that I didn't know what to do. Fundamentally, I think we all know what to do, right? Who doesn't know that if you want to lose weight, you got to eat right and exercise? Does
Mhm.
anybody not know that? Do we really need another diet book to tell us that? Who doesn't know that if you want to have better relationships with the people you love, you have to be fully present with them as opposed to checking your phone in the middle of dinner? Does anybody not know that? We know that, but we do it anyway. Does anybody not know that if you want to be better at your job, you have to do the work, especially the hard stuff that other people don't want to do? We know this. The question is not, what do we do, or why don't we know what to do? The question is, why don't we freaking do it?
Mhm.
So that question really fascinated me, and it's fascinated people for at least the past 2,500 years. In fact, Plato, the Greek philosopher, talked about this very same problem. In the Greek, he called it akrasia, the tendency to do things against our better interests. And this is kind of an age-old question of why is it that despite knowing what to do, we don't do what we say we are going to? And so I really wanted to dive into this question. And it started initially from thinking, oh, it's technology's fault. But of course, what I discovered is that it's not technology's fault, that technology is just the proximal cause. It's not the root cause of the problem, that people have always been struggling with distraction. It's an age-old problem, and people complain the same way they do today about phones and social media. They complained about the radio and the newspaper, and before that, the written word, right? Like all new technologies, people freak out and think is melting their brain, and that's never the answer. It's just an excuse. So I really wanted to go deeper into the psychology of why do we get distracted in the first place, because this is the skill of the century, right? So that even though distraction is not a new problem, today, I think it's harder than ever to fight against unless you know what you're doing. That this will become the skill of the century. That it's a macro skill, right? If you're not reading enough books, if you're not spending enough quality time with your family, if you're not exercising, whatever it is in your life that you're not doing that you think you should, the reason why is that you're distracted, right? Before you learn any other tips and tricks and life hacks, you got to learn how to manage your own attention, because controlling your attention is really how we control our life. So I really wanted this skill for myself. And so it took me 5 years to write this book, because I didn't want just another surface level answer of, oh, go on a digital detox, or, uninstall an app. Like that doesn't work. You really need to understand the deeper psychology behind distraction in the first place.
That makes total sense. And I remember an example in your book was when you discuss how your relationships depend on becoming, indistractable. Can you share a little bit more about that with our audience today? Like, what are some good first steps they can take towards being indistractable?
Yeah, so it starts by first defining what is distraction. And so this is an important one. So the best way to know if you understand what distraction is to know if you understand what distraction is not. So
Mhm.
if you ask people what's the opposite of distraction, most people will tell you it's focus, right? The opposite of distraction is focus, but not exactly. You see, if you look at the origin of the word, you'll find that the opposite of distraction is not focus. The opposite of distraction is traction. That both words come from the same Latin root, trahare, which means to pull, and they both end in the same 6 letters, A-C-T-I-O-N, that spells action. So traction, by definition, is any action that pulls you towards what you said you were going to do, things that you do with intent, things that move you closer to your goals and help you live out your values and become the kind of person you want to become. Those are acts of traction. The opposite of traction is distraction. Distraction is any action that pulls you further away from what you plan to do, further away from your goals, further away from your values, and further away from becoming the kind of person you want to become. So this is really important. This isn't just semantics. This is super important, because I would argue any action can be traction or distraction based on forethought, right? So for example, I used to sit down at my desk every morning for years and say, okay, I got that big project I have to do right now. I've been delaying on it. I've been procrastinating, but no more. I'm going to get to work on it. I'm going to get started right now. I'm going to finish it. Here I go. But first, let me check some email. right? Let me just scroll that Slack channel real quick. Let me just catch up on a few things. I'll do the easy things on my to-do list real quick just to get some momentum going. And what I didn't realize is that because I thought it was a work-related task, I was allowing distraction to trick me. And this is the most dangerous form of distraction. This is what tends to get people. People think, oh, the Facebook and Instagram and YouTube are distractions. No, it tends to be work distractions, working on the wrong thing, right? Or I should say the right thing at the wrong time is just as much of a distraction. So if you're checking work-related email, right, that's a work-related task. But if what you really need to do is work on that big project, because that's what you said you were going to do with your time, that's just as much of a distraction as playing a video game. So that's the most harmful form of distraction because you don't even realize it's happening to you. So that's the first thing, that any action can be a distraction. Even if it's a work-related task, doesn't mean it's not a distraction. If it's not what you said you were going to do with your time in advance, it's just as much of a distraction. Conversely, any action can be traction. So I hate this narrative that we hear these days, this moralizing and medicalizing of normal behavior. There's nothing wrong with going on Facebook. There's nothing wrong with watching YouTube videos. There's nothing wrong with any of this stuff as long as you do it on your schedule and according to your values. So if you plan time in your day to watch Netflix or scroll Instagram or whatever it is, great, do it, enjoy it. Don't feel guilty about it, but do it on your schedule. Don't do it because of somebody else's schedule or somebody else's values. So, the idea here is that I wanted a tech positive approach because I think there's a lot of tech bashing right now that is just a moral panic, right? It's people who aren't comfortable with these crazy new technologies of video games and social media, and they're getting all upset about it and calling it an addiction, when for the vast majority of people, it is not an addiction. It is simply a distraction. But distraction we can do something about, starting by understanding what is the difference between traction and distraction in your life.
That makes total sense. I love that. And I think that's a really helpful mental model for our audience to use as well. Aside from Hooked and Indestructible, what are some books that you feel that everyone in Silicon Valley would benefit from reading?
Oof, there's a lot of them. So a few of my recent favorites, Alchemy by Rory Sutherland, I think is a fantastic book. Rory Sutherland is kind of a well-known name in the behavioral economics and behavioral design space. And I think it's a brilliant book. Alchemy is wonderful. Another book I really like, I think everyone should read, is Factfulness by Hans Rosling. And that's a wonderful book because I think so basically the premise is that he gave a bunch of professors a test, a quiz on the state of the world. And, different aspects of how well is the world doing? How are we doing on public health? How are we doing on education? How are we doing on the empowerment of women? How are we doing, all different kind of aspects, the environment, all different aspects of how is the world these days? And with this battery of questions, he found that college professors scored worse than monkeys.
Oh, wow.
That if monkeys had answered at random, they would have done better than these professors. And it turns out that most people have an unduly negative perception of how bad the world is, that the world they think is much worse than it actually is. And so Factfulness actually is this great wake-up call that should make us optimistic about the fact that the world is getting better. Of course, the reason we don't believe this, and people are saying, oh, how can that be true, is because the news media has an incentive based on the hook model, based on variable rewards, to keep you watching bad news, right? Nobody wants to see a story about, hey, thousands of people flew around the world in metal tubes at 30,000 feet, flying at almost the speed of sound and landed safely at their destination just fine. Nobody wants to hear that. We want to hear about the horrible plane crash. And so that's why we only see this steady diet of bad news. It turns out the world is getting better and better in almost every conceivable way. And so that this book, Factfulness, I think is a must read.
That's awesome. And our audience should definitely check that out. In the recent years, you've invested a lot in companies, angel invested in a lot of companies, including, Eventbrite, Anchor.fm, which was acquired by Spotify, Product Hunt, which was acquired by AngelList, and Refresh.io, which was acquired by LinkedIn. So do you have like a guiding framework or philosophy for analyzing the products you invest in? I'm curious how you go about thinking about that.
Yeah, so I only invest in companies that utilize the hook model. So that's kind of my investment thesis. So so far so good. I've invested in 5 unicorns out of 30 companies I've invested in over the
That's awesome.
past 10 years or so. So far so good. And that's my investment thesis. I don't invest in any companies that don't utilize the hook model. Not that you can't build a good business without it. If it's a product that, like I said, is not used frequently, you don't need the hook model. So cybersecurity, for example, is a great example. I don't really do much in cybersecurity because they don't really need my help. But what the kind of companies that I do think I can be helpful to are the kind of companies that need repeat engagement. So I do a lot of ed tech, fintech, health tech. That tends to be kind of my area of focus. So what do I look for? I look for a big addressable market. That's usually the first criteria, a company that can really make a big impact in a market that's sizable. And then I look for, do they follow the hook model, right? Do they have a prototype of the hook model in action? And if they do, that's where I tend to dive deeper and learn about the team and learn about what kind of traction they've made so far. But yeah, so that's my competitive advantage is I think I can spot companies that have the potential to be habit forming before others can.
That's awesome. That's a very unique take. Are there, out of curiosity, any companies that you recently invested in or that you're looking at that you're super excited about?
Oh, there are several. So I invested in Kahoot a few years back, and that's today one of the world's largest educational software companies. I think they're valued at over $3 or $4 billion that uses the hook model. Another company that went public recently, Amplitude, is a company that I'm a shareholder in, and they've done incredibly well. They just went public 2 months ago. And I'm also a product evangelist for them, so I love their product. What else? I think the education space is very interesting. I made a couple of investments. I invested in a company called Wise out of India that's bringing online education to people who don't have broadband. Maven is another company that does cohort-based learning. So yeah, there's all kinds of cool companies out there that are building healthy habits.
That's awesome. That's really cool to hear. And I like that you have your own unique take on that. And it's definitely paid off really well. Okay, so to wrap up, what advice do you have for product builders who want to make, sticky and retentive products? Is there anything else that we didn't cover today that you think people should be mindful of?
I think, one of the best pieces of advice I can give you is to follow what I call the manipulation matrix. And this is something that was in my book back when it was published in 2012. It's in Hooked in the chapter on the morality of manipulation, where I ask people to have this 2-part test to make sure that they're acting ethically when it comes to using these techniques. And the 2-part test is this. Number one, can you look at yourself in the mirror and answer in the affirmative to this question? That is what I'm working on materially improving people's lives. Okay, that's the first question you have to ask yourself. Is what I'm working on materially improving people's lives? Yes or no? But that's not enough. The second question is, am I the user? And the reason I want you to answer yes, that you are the user, is that I want you to break the first rule of drug dealing, right? The first rule of drug dealing is never get high on your own supply. But I want you to get high on your own supply. I want you to use your own product. Why? Because that way, if there are any deleterious effects to using your product, you're going to be the first person to know about it. And I think if you can answer the affirmative to those 2 questions, is this materially improving people's lives? And am I the user? Yes, I am the user. You're what I call a facilitator. Not only is that a good ethical place to be, it actually makes product building a lot easier. And I think people forget what an amazing hack it is to build for yourself. The hardest part about building a successful product and getting it to product market fit is making sure you're building something people want. So a wonderful hack that product builders should use is build what you need, right? If you think about the founders of Facebook and Google and YouTube and Instagram, they were building stuff they wanted. It's an incredible hack that I think not enough people use. Build for yourself. And so if you do that, if you materially improve people's lives and you are the user, you can use these behavioral design techniques with good conscience because you're using them for yourself. And I think that's not only a good ethical place to be, but you're much more likely to actually succeed.
That's awesome. That's really good advice. And that's a framework that I think most people probably haven't heard of before. This was excellent. Thank you so much for your time today, Nir.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you.